but obviously very important work. Kim, anything you want to add?
Yeah, just following up on that, I too want to express my gratitude for all the work and the extra meetings that we're having, acknowledging that those are getting on the schedule, all for good and important reasons, right? Like we're coming up with these recommendations and they'll go forward to the commission, and having hopefully been vetted and well thought out and consent and built around consensus. So I think the outcome's good. I too want to acknowledge the a slight change in procedure this year that I think has worked out well, and that is that the recommendations, any recommendation can move forward. However, we're trying to stay focused on ones that have been discussed and vetted this year. So keep that in mind as we start going through this process, that those are considered more of a priority in getting votes forwarded than other ones. So with that, Mark, thank you.
Thank you. And actually, I'll build on that as we move into public comments. We'll just take a few minutes to hear any comments from any members of the public. And if comments could be focused on the recommendations that are in front of the MWG rather than other topics, that's appreciated. So I see a hand from Sine. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Mark. Thank you so much. Thank you all for having me. One moment. My name is Sinai Emmanuel. I'm the Progressive Maryland's Climate Policy Analyst, and I'm concerned about environmental justice issues across our state that impact overburdened Marylanders. So my colleague, Sir James, and I have connected, and I've had heart-wrenching conversations with hundreds of residents in South Baltimore neighborhoods of Cherry Hill and Westport, who share that they are suffering from various negative impacts of air pollution stemming from the Bresco plant burning garbage in their neighborhood. Exposure to toxic pollution like mercury, lead, NOx, and CO2 from the incinerator triggers and worsens upper respiratory health issues, which is catastrophic in a city already suffering from disproportionately high asthma rates. I'll share the story of Mikhail, a single dad of one, lifelong Marylander who moved to Cherry Hill in 2018, who began to deal with respiratory symptoms which are now worsened and continue to significantly impact his life. Once a healthy man, Mikhail and his doctor now strongly believe that pollution and poor air quality in his community has contributed to his respiratory issues. In some of our conversations on his environmental justice concerns, he complained about the horrible air quality and the emotional toll of always struggling to breathe. Tragically, he worries not only about how pollution impacts him, but above all, how it impacts his daughter, and that if she stays in Cherry Hill, that her health will also deteriorate. Mikhail and his family are just one example of the many impacted by environmental racism and health disparities in the city and beyond. Here's where the state can help and step in and address environmental justice concerns. We ought to prioritize cleaning up the renewable portfolio standard, in which the state sends millions of dollars in subsidies to burn trash in Black and Brown communities across the state. Those dollars should be going towards composting, establishing Maryland on an equitable clean energy path, and zero waste initiatives like compost, recycling, and waste reduction. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sinai. And I see one other commenter, Jeff Silva. Go ahead, Jeff.
Hi, thank you very much. I want to congratulate you all on taking on this miserable task. And as a general public member who manages to visit and witness all the other working groups, which I have the privilege to be able to do, I want to share an observation basically that with the mitigation working group, because I believe that you are the most dynamic in being able to confront the crisis of climate or global warming. And in review, basically it's this: mitigation is the only field that Maryland could throw at at having revenue collected to be able to buy polluters and by people whose use of natural resources are causing the problem to be worse. And you are the only people that are in position to be able to fund not only your recommendations, but the recommendations of the adaptation resiliency work group, the science and technology work group. It's an awesome responsibility. And in support of that, I always try to read your documentation. And I would dare say, recommendation 21 that you folks will be discussing, I agree with it fully. And also, I think it should be not only by vehicle weight, but by engine size. Say, for example, like a Corvette, which has a 6-liter engine, but it's only a 2-seater, as compared to a 6-liter engine in a truck that is actually performing some sort of business activity. Those, of course, the truck has the weight, but the Corvette also has the vehicle size. And also, I would recommend taxing aviation fuel. Their studies have shown that people with, or the income group in the top percentile, they tend to be the people that are producing the most pollution on a per capita basis. So I agree with recommendation 21. I think you're on the right path, and you have my full support. Bye now.
Jeff. Thanks, Jeff. I do recognize we also have hands up from Jennifer and Andrew. We're over our time allotment for public comments. I apologize for having to cut it off. We have a packed agenda. If we are to get to recommendation 21 today, we'll need to jump right in. Do feel free to take to the comments throughout the meeting, MWG members, commission members, and members of the public to weigh in as the MWG debates these topics. There was a online vote, following the last meeting that happened a couple of weeks ago. We asked MWG members to vote via email on a number of recommendations. Some recommendations were approved through that process because the majority of voting members voted in favor of those recommendations. Most of the recommendations were essentially flagged for needing further discussion. So we have a long list of recommendations that had sort of an initial vote, but are recommended for additional discussion. And what we've done today is put them in order of the ones that received the most support through the online voting, but just not quite enough support to get it over the line to call it approved. So where we're going to start today is recommendation 17, and I'll screen share so that everyone can see the recommendations all together. And as I'm pulling this up, go ahead, Sandy.
Thanks. So I had a question or a comment for recommendation 12, and I know that it was approved by online voting, but I just want to make the commissioners or the working group members aware that we do not own the lines that the MARC trains operate on. Out of all of the service lines that we run our MARC trains on, we actually only own 3 miles of track in Frederick County. So it's CSX and Amtrak that would have to support electrified MARC trains. And I just wanted to just make that comment because it's not totally within our means to convert things to electric if we don't have the infrastructure to support it. So my recommendation might be to do a friendly amendment to number 12 to transition to cleaner technology MARC trains or something similar to that, just with the awareness of the group that we don't own the tracks that we provide that service on. It's owned by CSX and Amtrak for the most part. And I just wanted to make that comment. That's all.
Okay, thanks. And I think what I question for the co-chairs, my recommendation is that we kind of put a pin in that if there's time either in today's meeting or in the meeting in 2 weeks from now to revisit for wordsmithing any recommendations that were approved, that we might cross that bridge then. But Kim and Mike, how do you want to proceed?
I concur.
I would agree. I would add or polling again by email.
Okay. I guess on Sandy opened the door to agencies. Really quick comment on Advanced Clean Cars 2. That regulation is now fully adopted. So just want everyone to be aware that that is adopted and under force. So where we're going to start today is let's see, recommendation 17. And I might ask Tom Ballantyne. I think I saw you here with us. Good seeing you, Tom. If you wanted to say a minute to sort of set this one up for discussion.
Sure, thanks. The part of the motivation for this is the results of the Montgomery County ICF study that compared the cost of zero net carbon building modifications against the available incentives, showed that about 7% of total costs could be covered by the incentives that were in place when that study was done. Doesn't include the changes that have been made in recent months, but it seems pretty clear that there's going to be additional challenges to the dealing with the costs and not enough financial incentive available. By doing a property tax deduction, it's something that pretty much any of these either commercial entities or residential buildings that are covered by the Building Energy Performance Standard can access and utilize. I thought it was also important to include recordation and personal property tax. Recordation tax is a way that small businesses and others will access capital to make building improvements. And the recordation tax is applied to mortgages that are recorded in the land records. It just makes it more difficult to access capital. I'll just leave it there for any other discussion or questions. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Kim.
Thanks, Tom. So are you recommending what the deduction is or should be, or are you saying one should be created and then the details will get figured out?
I think I'm the latter.
Okay.
Thanks. And Garrett?
And Tom, just to clarify, we're talking about state taxes, correct? Not county tax?
Well, I think both should be on the table. The state tax is such a small percentage of what the real estate tax bill is for homeowners and businesses.
I think it's certainly it's a complication, right? If we're talking about taxing at both scales here, I guess I'm less clear on how this will work. I'm sure with my MACO hat on, we're not in favor of increased taxes at the county level and would prefer that this be defined as a state level measure, but I'm sure you understand.
Well, just to be clear, I wasn't suggesting an increase in the tax, but a tax deduction for the building ownership group, whether it's a residence or business.
Right. Yeah. So the question is where the lost revenue is occurring.
I'm not surprised that would be a concern from MACO, but it's, I think, a proposal that's pretty direct and relates back to the building stock.
Mike?
Yeah, I would speak in favor of this one. And I represent a lot of building owners, and the numbers that have been coming in are just for what it's going to cost to decarbonize is just stunning. We're not talking about millions. We're talking about billions of dollars. And the commercial building segment is facing huge problems because of the remote work revolution. They suddenly have got people who are occupying only half of their space, and as soon as their leases expire, they give back half their space or they relocate. So we've got to find some way to give significant benefits to those who invest in decarbonization. I think this is the best way we're going to find to be able to do it. It will only benefit those who spend the money to decarbonize. If we don't do this, I think we're frankly abandoning that. We just spent a lot of time talking about incentives for transportation transition. We're going to need it on the building side too.
Delegate Stein.
Thanks. Thanks, Mark. Tom, two questions. First one is, you refer to it as a real property tax deduction. So does that mean it would be a reduction of the assessed value, or are you thinking of a tax credit?
Well, I think it could be structured either way. One of the things that may happen and has come up in the context of community solar is that the equipment will be assessed and there'll be some sort of increased valuation to that. But a credit that functions somewhat like a historic tax credit could be an appropriate way to structure it. But it trying not to put too many boundaries on it, but to put that kind of concept in front of the decision makers like you who can guide it toward towards an appropriate final structure. Sure.
Okay. And my second question is, would this apply to homes as well as businesses?
I think it should. The building energy performance standard is going to apply to tens of thousands, 100,000 individual apartment and condominium units, and down the line there'll be an expansion of the conversion of single family and townhouses eventually, right? So.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Brian.
Hey, Tom. Delegate Stein, I think, asked the first question I was going to ask. I was just curious if it would be something that would be sort of assessed in perpetuity, or would be a one-time credit for the cost of the equipment. I mean, I think I'd be leery of it having a prolonged impact on the tax assessment and funds available for local schools and that sort of thing. But at a high level, I like the idea. So I definitely think the devil's in the details. Separately, I was curious if you'd consider this along the lines of or as an income tax deduction or tax credit, as opposed to a property tax credit or reduction.
I think the income tax credit becomes more challenging at some point. There are real estate investment trusts going to be able to qualify for an income tax deduction. There have been some changes at the federal level. I don't fully understand them. And I'm not sure we have the capability at this level to deal with that. And you also have condominium associations that may have no income or very little income, making changes and then assessing the owners in the association. I think it becomes more complicated and less direct at that point.
Kim?
I'm pulling back on this because every single recommendation we could, we need to be aware of how much it's going to cost, right? Billions of dollars. We say that frequently and recognize it. I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about the transportation sector and the billions of dollars. So I get it. I am concerned that since every action is going to cost money, that we are already starting to carve out less revenue for counties, less revenue for state to balance this. So what I'm not putting an amendment forward, but as a conversation discussion piece, is to actually change the word create and replace it with consider or recommend, or, you know, flesh this idea out a little bit more so that if we know the details and we know how it would fit into the bigger picture. So just as a conversation piece, I put that up.
Ian?
I share many of Kim's thoughts. Obviously, we also have the IRA, which has tremendous tax advantages for some of the improvements. And I think is part of the context here. I'm not saying it's a replacement, and I'm not saying I'm against it, but you know, that should be acknowledged as to help some. I know there's also there's all these parallel work groups and things. There's the Building Incentive Transition Task Force. You know, I don't know if this is on their agenda or not, or if it's been proposed. They might be in a better position slightly, not that it helps Mark at all, because it's all on him, but to, you know, do a little bit more analysis of this recommendation and provide a little bit more behind, you know, the degree of credit that might be needed here, because I know that's a concern in terms of cost, whether it's to the state or to the, you know, locals. So that's my contribution.
Jamal?
Yeah, I think I share some of those thoughts too. You know, it's not that I'm necessarily against a tax deduction or tax incentive of some sort. I think that this needs to be or I would like to at least learn more about it and consider it in the context of other incentives that are on the table too, recognizing that there are, you know, again, Ian just mentioned, but there are incentives at the federal level. You know, there are potentially incentives coming through Empower. And so how does this relate to that? And like, how are we supplementing those resources to really get to the sort of the root of the problem? So I think I would second, like, consider, but maybe also add consider a tax deduction, like maybe in the context of other incentives.
All right, I'll go to Dr. Holtman and, you know, flag for the co-chairs. We might need to figure out how to make a motion on this one. Dr. Holtman. Nate, I lost you on my screen, but I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry.
There
Thanks
you
for the earlier comments, and agreed with the importance of maybe fleshing out a little bit what the details are as they do affect a few different dimensions. We've been talking about critical areas of costs and who bears that. I think one of the dimensions that I think would also be helpful to know is there like an equity potential dimension to this, in the sense that maybe wealthy homeowners might be more likely to do it? How might that be structured in a careful way to make sure that we're balancing that out in the right way? That's all. Thanks.
So going back to the co-chairs, or Tom, in terms of any recommendation.
Look, I think the comments are constructive, and Kim's suggestion to consider is a good one. I think the you know, there's still details to be filled in on what Empower is going to do, and what the IRA is going to do. So and you might add credit. Going back to Delegate Stein's question.
as in a tax deduction or credit.
Yeah. I'm not sure deduction is the right term of art anyway, so.
Mark, do you want to vote recommendation by recommendation?
My hunch is that that'll be most efficient.
Okay, then I'll call the question with that amendment that Tom's offering.
All right, so we've got recommendation 17 teeing up for a vote. We're going to ask people, the MWG members, to use the little hand raise feature when you vote. So the first vote will be in favor of the recommendation as seen on the screen. Consider a real property tax deduction or credit for decarbonization improvements. The state should consider a real property tax deduction or credit for decarbonization expenses and exemptions from recordation and personal property taxes for decarbonization and equipment. And the votes in favor are almost unanimous on this one. So we've got 18-4. Great. All right, I will make a quick note of.
Mark, how many voting members do we have on today?
I counted 19 just a few minutes ago. So
And I have, unless he's joined in the last minute, I've got Tom Weisinger's proxy vote, so you can add his as well.
That's right. Thank you.
And I'm a proxy for Michelle Dietz.
Oh, great. Oh, thanks, Kate. So just for everyone following along, basically, if we receive 10 or more votes in favor of something, then it passes. Alrighty, great. Next one on the list. Oh, go ahead, Bob.
I think you ought to record somewhere what the vote is. I realize the statement, 10 or more vote, it passes, but someone may ask how close was it, as opposed to it just passed. So in the meeting, there's no meeting record, but I just think somewhere that not necessarily by individual, but 11-6 and so many instances. That's just my opinion.
Yep, fair enough. So quick vote, all opposed to recommendation 17, please raise your hand. Thank you. And any abstentions? Thanks. Nicole, can you confirm if that was in opposition or abstention?
No, sorry. That was an accident.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you all. The next one is recommendation 13. This one was submitted by co-chair Kim Coble. So Kim, do you want to take a minute to speak to this one?
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Just as background, in 2009, when the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act was drafted and approved, there was an exemption for the manufacturing industry that was included at that time. And there was a requirement that a study be done, which University of Maryland conducted in 2022, I believe, and an independent study of that exemption. And they concluded that the manufacturing sector produced about 4 million megatons of CO2 equivalent. 2.5 of that was produced by 2 cement plants, and 1.5 came from non-cement manufacturing. And so one could argue, and I've heard some people argue that, well, that's a small amount, so we don't need to include them. And yet we have a pathway report, which is calling for all of society. That's everybody has to step up, including the building industry and homeowners and car owners and et cetera, et cetera. So in light of what is being asked of all of society in Maryland, I am recommending that that exemption be removed and that the manufacturing industry is included as part of society.
Thank you, Kim. Any discussion of this one? Go ahead, Mike.
Well, since, full disclosure, I drafted the original manufacturing exemption, so I guess it's not surprising that I have a different view than Kim. As she pointed out, manufacturing, other than the cement guys, is really a very small part here. But what's different about manufacturing is that they compete directly with other states and other countries. And we've seen manufacturing in Maryland just basically get devastated. All the big manufacturers, or almost all of them, are gone. The General Motors, the Bethlehem Steels, I could go on and on. We just got a couple of them left. And I think we're trying here too hard to get blood out of the turnip. And we're simply going to result in those greenhouse gas emissions still going into the air, but just going into the air elsewhere. I mean, I had a client who got run out of business by competition from China. The company in China bought all of their equipment, manufacturing equipment, moved it to China, including the air pollution control equipment, then had the formerly unionized employees here go over to China to reassemble it, except they were told don't bother to attach the air pollution equipment. And that's what happens if you get too far ahead on an organization that has to compete directly with people just across the border. So this is one where I'm in opposition.
Thanks, Mike. Well, I guess one quick point in terms of how some states are applying GHG-focused regulations to industries is providing an exemption to energy-intensive and trade-exposed industries. So I think that there's, you know, a potential of including, you know, parts of the manufacturing sector while still providing some protections for industries that are likely displaced because of policy.
Are you suggesting that as an amendment to this? Because it's not what it currently says. It simply repeals the manufacturing. It doesn't say except for industries that are subject to, or energy intensive, or subject to competition.
I was only providing it as a I guess point of order or informational item. I don't think I'm in a position to offer an amendment. Let's see, Jennifer.
I'm in strong support of this. I believe it's in the best interest of the state and the world. And I don't want to be in a race to the bottom versus Virginia and Pennsylvania on climate issues. I think that we could and should support carbon taxes and or cap and invest. And we don't have a robust recommendation ready on that. And this is a good step in the right direction. I want to thank Kim for bringing it forward.
Thank you, Jennifer. Brian.
So, Michael, I think the phenomenon you're referring to here is emissions leakage. And it's something that we're very familiar with in the power sector. And it's definitely an issue for industries that are, as Mark said, trade exposed. I do think that there are more targeted interventions that can help mitigate some of these issues. So a blanket exemption, I think, might be too, just too lax. I think it's possible to bring all of these industries within an emissions framework, an emissions mitigation framework, but provide, some means for offsetting the potential increased costs and how that would affect our local industries relative to their, counterparts elsewhere in the U.S. and globally. So I would advocate for something a little bit more targeted as opposed to something that just involves a blanket exemption.
Thank you. Bob Wright.
Yes, I agree with Michael and Brian. it just creates leakage. So you're not producing it here, but could occur, and push it off and do it in Pennsylvania, or push it off and do it in Virginia. I don't think that solves the overall problem. So I think more thought needs to go into what you hope to accomplish here.
Thanks. Tom?
Just want to clarify, Kim, does this remove the exemption for manufacturing that's in the building energy performance standard as well?
I don't know.
It would not, I should know this like the back of my hand now. I think manufacturing facilities were specifically exempt from BEPS. So that exemption would hold.
But I think the question mark is why were they exempted in the regulation? I think they were exempted in the regulation because of this statute. And by the way, the language you suggested might be something I supported if Kim were interested in an amendment to, rather than, just so there's no confusion, this is an exemption that exists in the statute. We simply repeal it. There wouldn't be anything to distinguish between some manufacturers and others.
I know there's a number of comments up, but as the author, I'll just offer this. Perhaps as a time-saving mechanism, anybody that's interested could join Mike and I in another meeting, and we can come back next meeting with a recommendation that there's consensus around.
I'd be open to that.
Okay, well, I think that is a great solution. So we will table recommendation 13 for the time being, unless Mike or Kim, you want to take any additional comments on it here. Do you want to move all comments to a separate meeting on that one?
I think unless somebody feels strongly and want to, I mean, I don't want to cut anybody off, but would prefer to defer it if people are willing.
Yeah, I've noticed. So Elizabeth, Nate, Garrett, if you want to say something, chime in. Otherwise, we'll include you in the subgroup discussion.
I'm just going to chime in, and sorry, I'm going to be traveling in China for the next couple of weeks. I may miss the meeting. So let me just say my comment here and trust you all to work on it. To the extent that this can be considered, I think it would be helpful to, first of all, I'd like to kind of point out that I would agree with earlier comments that there could be specific types of interventions that are undertaken in the manufacturing sectors, as they, it's different kinds of industries and different processes. The ones that are noted in the report that was mentioned earlier are already aware of and are potentially, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but potentially thinking about strategies that they could undertake to address their own emissions. I'm not saying that's their policy, but they are aware of it and thinking about it. I will also note that we are on a path to 2045 net zero in Maryland. It is pretty much a given that industrial actors and manufacturers across the United States will be needing to wrestle with these questions, not maybe in the next 3 years, but no doubt in the next 7 to 10. I want that just to be kind of a, it's not like 2030 is the end goal here. It's going to be going on. And so the leakage question is fair. It's real, but it's also something that I think has to be taken in that larger context as well. And then the final thing I would just mention is that it's not entirely obvious to me, as not the person who wrote the actual legislation, but why repealing the mandate not to regulate would require the state to regulate the manufacturing sector. So I don't think we're actually asking them to do anything. We're just saying to be able to include the manufacturing sector in the overall strategy that Maryland is undertaking, and that may include doing nothing. It just is right now. It's completely off the books. And when you do look at the overall pathway for Maryland or the United States or anybody else, you want to keep all your options on the table because there might be specific interventions that are low cost and high volume emissions reduction that you don't want to necessarily take off the table. So that's my comments, and thanks for allowing me to get those in.
Thanks, Nate. Elizabeth, final word on this?
Yeah, I just had a clarification question. I agree this should be deferred and we try to reach consensus. But in that vein, Kim, I read your proposed suggestion, and specifically the language that the policymakers can facilitate the sector's low carbon transition through market and non-market based policy mechanisms to be a vehicle to address the concerns, legitimate concerns that others have raised in this. Is that what you were imagining by that language? And if this is too cumbersome a conversation for right now, then let's just defer it to the subgroup.
Yeah, I was just quoting the University of Maryland study on that. That's what they said.
All right, well,
Sounds like The Office.
thank you for offering to have another meeting, Kim and Mike. So appreciated, but I think that's a good solution. All right, so we'll table that one and set up an ad hoc group to discuss. Going then to recommendation 9. Recommendation 9, adopt the heavy-duty omnibus low NOx regulation. I want to first see if we can go to Lewis on this, because I know, Lewis, you'd submitted a comment by email, and I think I saw that you were able to join us today.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay, Mark? Yeah, sorry. So, last year we actually had this as a recommendation, first of all, that the mitigation work group did not adopt. And since this time, the truck engine manufacturers have entered into an MOU with the state of California about 2 months ago that essentially brings them into the same standard for NOx that US EPA will have in 2027. So the reason why I suggest that this recommendation is not needed is because it is bringing really a national low NOx standard into play. In effect, what happened is the manufacturers could not meet the standard that California had for the next 2 model years. And so this allows them to continue to sell trucks in California, not meeting the original California published low NOx regulation, and now bringing California into the same standard that the US EPA has adopted.
Thank you. And Elizabeth, I believe this recommendation came from you. So do you want to speak to it?
Yeah, thanks, Mark and others. I don't entirely. I mostly agree with Lewis's comments about how the landscape has changed. But that said, there are environmental advocates who still believe it's important to adopt this regulation. And just by way of information, New York, Connecticut, and Rhode Island have done so, even though the MOU that Lewis mentioned has been adopted. But all that said, this is something as you can probably tell from my stammering, I am very much not an expert on. So if it would be, I just may withdraw this rather than bringing it to a vote. But if we could defer this one too, while I have a chance to do a little bit more background research, I would appreciate that opportunity.
Sure. I mean, one option is we can table this for the meeting on, I think it's October 19th, is actually essentially the final MWG meeting and voting session to finalize recommendations for the commission. So how about we table this, and you can let us know anytime between now and then if you want to keep it on the agenda or pull it.
Okay, thanks so much.
Okay, co-chairs, do you agree with that?
Yeah, it sounds great.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you.
All right. Alrighty, next then is recommendation 3. Create a dealer engagement program. This is one that we've discussed a bit here. The idea was providing grants of up to $50,000 to help independent used car dealerships install EV chargers on site so that they're ready to sell EVs. The dealers would also make those chargers available for public use. There's sort of a second component to this recommendation around providing a $200 incentive to a car salesperson who sells an EV, so on and so forth. So you can see the recommendation there. Any discussion on this? Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, we heard from all of the dealers who I talked to, and when they were here, the $200 incentive to car salespeople, they don't think really does anything. If a car salesperson can sell the EV that's sitting on a lot, he's going to sell the EV that's sitting on the lot. It's just not much impact. And the large car dealers really don't care about the grants for installing EV chargers. They're all going to be required by the manufacturers to install the EV chargers. So I don't think we've got as much demand for this, but I can imagine a small program for basically the guy who's got a used car dealership on the corner. So though I could support a small program here, I wouldn't support the 200 incentive, and I would define it as just for a smaller program, much less than 5 million a year for the dealer portion of it, because I think we need the money on the other side to create demand. I think because of the clean cars rule, the manufacturers are going to be trying to sell the EVs here. The question is, there going to be enough demand? And we're talking about used car dealerships here. We don't get used EVs until we first have sold new EVs. So I started to just oppose the whole thing, but I could imagine a very small program that would make some sense.
Thanks. Bob?
Yes, I agree with Mike, except I would go one step further and say strike the sentence about the $200 incentive. I don't think the salespeople or their employer need that incentive to sell the EV vehicles. Even a small one might appreciate it, but I think it starts to get complicated now by keeping it for small ones. So I can't support it unless the $200 incentive is struck.
All right, so let me go to Jennifer, but it does sound like we're moving toward an amendment that would perhaps keep the grant for EV charging equipment at the used car dealerships, but striking the $200 incentive. Jennifer.
Yes, I would like to make that as a recommendation and agree with that. I did meet with multiple car dealers on this and think that would help us. I didn't know if Michael was suggesting we put into this that we do a marketing campaign to drive up demand for EVs, or whether we have a separate proposal on that I think would be very helpful to have.
Just two quick comments on that. Mark, my actual proposal was also that we limit the amount of the program. I wouldn't go a $5 million program because we think we need the $5 million for something else. I don't think I put a number on it, but I probably would suggest that, up to 1 million, because we use the up to language on the EV. So whatever we said, up to or no more than, I think we said no more than 1 million per year. And Jennifer, I think you're right. We need an advertising program. I didn't raise that in my amendment here because I thought that one of the other work groups is working on that, the eco work group. I certainly would be agreeable with it. It's just a question of who's doing what.
Thanks, Mike. Kim.
Yeah, I agree with all that's being said here, but I do have a question about, is it saying that one dealer can get up to $50,000 to install an EV charger? I mean, isn't that a crazy amount?
I work with the convenience store owners, and with handicap parking requirements for the space they got to need, and for the understanding you need to put in more than one charger if you're going to attract people. They're estimating that a typical bank of 4 chargers will cost about $500,000. Now that's the convenience store. That's right, 7-Elevens and the Royal Farms. I assume that the guy on the corner may only put in 1 or 2, but he's going to need to charge more than 1 or 2 car a day if he's got a lot of used cars. So,
well,
50,000 is a lot, actually.
I mean, I thought what we were trying to do here is to help the car dealer install chargers so that they can sell EVs more proficiently in their, that's a way of assisting them to sell the EVs, not, and as they do that, make them available, not to provide a whole bank of EV chargers to everybody. So,
yeah. Look, this is not a program I like a lot, but for what it's worth, if you've got a lot with, say, 25, 30 cars, and you're trying to keep them all charged up for demo drives and everything else, how many fast chargers do you need? How many do you need? If you got a car lot on the corner and you got, I don't know, 20 cars.
Well, I guess, so let me just, in trying to move this forward, I would suggest that 50,000 is a lot to give for this $1 million program, like a small bite, and it's kind of to see how it works. But I'm not going to die on my sword on it. So
I don't feel strongly either. If you want to suggest another number,
I don't know, 30,000, 25.
And the only thing I can offer here is that these are the numbers that we got from the consultant's report.
Okay.
Unless any of the consultants on the line want to correct the record on that, but I think that their recommendation was 50,000 per independent used car dealer and a total budget of up to $1 million for the EV.
Okay, I'll stand down.
Jennifer.
Yes, I don't think that there's a law yet that people who don't have EVs should not park in charging stations. And I wonder, since we're talking about charging stations, if we should also recommend saying that only cars that are EVs can park in charging stations.
There's, just to comment on that, we have a law in the books that says that if they're properly labeled with a sign, and unfortunately it requires the exact language of the sign, which is the problem, then you can get a ticket issued if it's not an EV in that space. The problem is that, I mean, I drive an EV and I almost never see a sign with the right language on it.
So the issue is on the implementation side in terms of having the right signage, and not that new law is required.
Or amend the law so that you don't have to have the exact language, but just have it labeled. I mean, there's nothing on a handicap spot that says that if you park in this handicap spot, then you are subject to exactly this amount of penalty and exactly this time if you're not doing exactly this. But that's the EV language. But there is a law in the books.
Interesting. Okay. Let's see, Bob.
Yes, two things about the $50,000. First, I've read a number of articles, and they do cost more than $50,000. And Rockville has recently installed a number at its community centers, and they are more than $50,000 each. So it seems high, but by the time you're said and done with all the things you have to do to comply, it's not an unreasonable number.
Thanks, Bob. Ian.
You're on mute, Ian.
Sorry about that. I guess MEA, I assume, would be theoretically administering this program, since, MEA does the current EVSE, program, which I'll just say we're at about 70% capacity right now, or uptake. by the way, for this fiscal year, which obviously we've got a ways to go. So that's just context on the personal side. But I'll just say this: it may be better to not list a limit at all and just, you know, allow the agency to sort of figure out where demand is on this and gauge it appropriately. I mean, we don't have a lot of flexibility on the current EVSC program, which hamstrings our ability to sort of manage it. And so we get into a situation where, you know, we're heavily oversubscribed, dealing with backlogs from one year to the next. So if I could make a suggestion, a little bit self-serving, but also just trying to, you know, sort of, I think, be flexible in the design of a potential program if it were to get funded, is that maybe we don't have to provide that specific number. So it's just a thought. I'll support it either way.
Ian, the number being the up to a million, or the up to 50,000 per?
Well,
project?
arguably both, but you know, the C fund right now, obviously, in some cases, MEA has some discretion in sort of how those funds are used. In other cases, we do not. So, you know, like the EVSC, it's very prescriptive. So you can't sort of manage demand and supply, you know, financing. So, you know, like I said, I'll support it regardless with the deletion. But, you know, that's just something to think about. That's all.
Okay. And, you know, to reduce the pressure on getting the numbers just right, of course, if any legislator were to carry this forward in a budget bill, there would be, I'm sure, additional involvement from stakeholders to right size the numbers for the final bill. Edward.
Hey, thanks, Mark. Just thinking this through a little bit more as far as what is a good incentive mechanism for EV adoption. Kind of considering that, you know, what we've seen from driving EV adoption from the utilities perspective is really going after the customer, less the dealer. Starting to question kind of the impacts of how this money could potentially be spent, and if there's other better uses for the funds that might go into this recommendation. You know, kind of my view is that a customer, for that choice between EV versus an ICE vehicle, they'd likely walk into the dealership, you know, knowing that they would either want the EV or the ICE, and you know, question how much a dealer would really influence that decision. So in lieu of that, thinking about, or with that in mind, thinking about making recommendations to increase customer education about EVs, so that more customers walk into the dealers, you know, that might be a better recommendation for EV adoption. And then similarly, when it comes to the chargers and where they're located, be it at a dealer or other areas, you know, we might be better use of this $50,000 to incentivize apartment buildings and other public spaces to have the EV chargers instead of a dealership. So just again, thinking kind of bigger picture, it just seems like we should go for the customer as opposed to the dealer. Those are my comments.
Okay, thanks, Ed. And yeah, lots of potential uses for limited dollars. Sandy?
Yeah, so I was thinking along the same lines as what Ed just mentioned. I feel like this recommendation is giving folks, dealers in particular, money towards their earning potential more so than focusing on the customer itself. But I also, you know, in looking at what some of the other states have done, most of them are more looking at tax credits and rebate type programs. And so I'm wondering whether or not, if we were going to give dealer engagement or dealerships some funding to promote electrification and you know, people purchasing electric vehicles, can it be tied to some sort of reporting out on the number of vehicles that they were able to sell and get out into the market during the course of the year, as opposed to just a blanket amount to help them with charging infrastructure. I would think that they would be motivated to have that as it is. And just another note on that is that Ford and some of the other OEMs have said to dealerships that unless you provide EV charging infrastructure at your locations and you have like the readiness in your service areas to support EVs, you're not going to get a lot of electric vehicles from us. So motivation wise, they're getting pushing from the OEMs in some cases to provide electric vehicle charging infrastructure just in order to get the stock in place. So long way of me saying I agree with it either being a different focus and more of a customer driven type program versus a dealership program, or a way to tie their performance in terms of getting the fleet conversion supported in Maryland to whatever they would get as a incentive or a rebate or whatever it might be. So that's it.
Thanks, Sandy. Kim?
Mhm.
Yeah. I guess I'm going to be calling the question here with a couple recommendations. Number one, I remember this conversation and we had the dealers at the meeting and got their input. There are other recommendations about how to incentivize people to buy cars. This was designed specifically for the dealers, and it's a very small program, $1 million, and for 3 years. So I support trying it. We had the input from the dealers and they supported it. Number one. Number two, both Ed and Jennifer have referenced the need, and I support this, for an education program. So Mark, what I'd like to do is have you talk to the ECOS group and find out exactly what they're putting forward, and we can take a look at that and see if we want to endorse their recommendation or have a separate one. But what we don't want to do is create a conflict between the two work groups. So let's get informed about what they're putting forward. So with that, I think I'll call the question.
Okay, will do. And the question to vote for the recommendation as amended on the screen. Alrighty. So MWG members, if you use the hand raise feature, if you're voting in favor of the recommendation as it is on the screen, which is providing a grant of up to $50,000 to help independent car dealerships install EV chargers on site, up to $1 million per year for 3 years for this program. All right, I believe that we have the votes for this to pass. That's 12 in favor. Hold your horses for a second, Brian. Or tell me if that was a late vote in favor.
That was a late vote in favor.
Okay, great. All right, and then
Mark, remember to count the proxies.
Oh, thank you. All right, and if there are any, I'm just going to lower this. Any opposed, please put your hand up. All right, thank you. And any abstentions? All right, thank you. All right, recommendation 3 approved as amended. Next on the list is recommendation 4. create a tax credit for low-income car-free Marylanders. Is there any discussion that you'd like to have on this one? Jennifer.
I don't think I understand the financial ramifications of this. Many of the car-free Marylanders don't pay income tax because their income is low. Do we have any sense of how many people we're talking about and what we're doing here? Would we be better to give more public transit vouchers to people who are low income?
I don't have the number for those who live in Maryland without a car. I did look at that one time. It is a significant number, but don't remember the number off the top of my head. And I'm pretty sure that this was coming in to us based on a similar proposal in California, and that's about all the background I have on this. Delegate Stein.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I had two comments. First, one was very similar to Jennifer's about the fact that many low-income Marylanders don't pay income taxes or eligible for programs if they're working that provide a credit for a certain amount of taxes. So if we did move forward with this, I would say including a refundable tax credit so that low-income Marylanders could be sure to take advantage of it. And then sort of related to the question for the first recommendation about property tax credit, is this one time or is this recurring?
Good questions. I think we'd have to add that specificity through amendment. Mike?
Yeah, I voted against this one, and let me explain why, because I obviously think we need to provide support to low-income Marylanders, but we're about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And if you'll excuse the pun, this is a free rider problem, right? I don't think $1,000 tax credit, even if you made it refundable, is going to necessarily make a person give up a car if they have a car. I think what you're going to find is lots of low-income people who do not currently have cars, and we're going to give them $1,000. I'd rather see that money spent on mass transit, where we would be supporting those who give up their cars, and maybe you'd even have a better system for giving support for mass transit low-income use. But I think giving a tax credit just for the fact that you don't own a car would be giving a lot of money out that would not necessarily reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. I think the money could be better spent on the purposes we have. If the purposes is just to help low-income Marylanders, there are a lot of programs to do that. I think the General Assembly can decide whether that's a good idea. But for us, we should only be proposing things that reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, so I hear a potential revision to be transit incentives for people who would turn in a vehicle.
I'd probably just oppose it at this point, because I think it's an entirely different. If what you're doing is talking about is a trade-in for people who turn in cars, I think that's a very different proposal. I think I'd just oppose this one.
All right, Brian?
I like the idea of tying the tax credit directly to people who are not using a vehicle, regardless of whether or not they actually have to turn one in to prove it. And the money would, in theory, likely find its way into the transit system through increased ridership, or it could be used for something like an e-bike, which currently don't have many viable, meaningful subsidies, certainly not in the same way that electric vehicles are supported. So I think it's putting money in the pockets of people who can then make decisions about their best way for them to travel, and it ensures that they are not traveling by vehicle. So I think it's a positive step. To Delegate Stein's point, I agree. I think we need to include language about this being a refundable credit, so it's not specifically tied to income, and that I think solved that problem there. Those are my 2 points.
Thanks, Brian. Jamal?
Yeah, I think I would echo the point about the refundable tax credit. I would also maybe put a finer point on a point that was already made. This feels like a very passive incentive, and I think what I would hope for would be, an active incentive to do something as opposed to like not do something. And so I would be in favor of an incentive for things like e-bikes, like Brian just mentioned, or public transit, or offer a choice. If you need to get around, here's an incentive for you to pursue or to get $1,000 or some amount of money as a credit on your transit pass, or you can use that for an e-bike. Like, you get a choice instead of making the decision for people. I think I would prefer both of those options as opposed to a tax credit, with the assumption that we are trying to reach low-income Marylanders.
Okay. I'm hearing different concepts that depart a bit from this recommendation. So I guess a couple of paths forward. One, if anyone wanted to attempt to have a separate meeting in the next couple of weeks to flesh this out, that's one option, as we saw with another recommendation. Another is that this be tabled for the NWG's 24 work plan for further discussion. So chew on that as we go to Bob.
Yes, I agree with Michael's assessment, which I don't know how you would go back and count or quantify the amount of CO2 reduction you got from this. So if you, all the other things I said are good points, but I think it's another program or another mechanism that ought to be putting money in their pockets to help them make a transportation choice.
All right, thanks. And we'll go to Elizabeth and then Ava in a second. Just a note that sometime within the next few minutes, apparently all of our phones will start blowing up with the test of the emergency alert system. So if everyone could jump on mute whenever that happens, that'd be great. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I hear all of the concerns and share many of them and have really mixed feelings about this proposal, although I strongly support, I think, the underlying goal of helping low-income Marylanders who don't have a car when everything else in our recommendations has been so focused on personal EV use. And I think this raises a point, a broader point that I totally understand and support the idea that we shouldn't be pushing proposals at the 11th hour that haven't been discussed during the year. But the negative side of that, or the unintended consequence of that vis-a-vis transportation, is that when we're not looking at transportation as a sector, we're losing huge opportunities. So, we don't have any recommendations, for example, on public transportation, mass transit, and what have you. So if we do defer it, I would hope that as part of our work plan, we can really look at transportation holistically as a sector rather than focusing on sort of the individual components, which I think leave us don't really give a full picture of what we're trying to accomplish in that sector.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like you just articulated the annual struggle of the MWD in having, we meet frequently, but it's not frequent enough to address the whole range of issues. Ava.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate the dialogue around this particular point, and I think there are some really great ideas that I just wanted to second. I think having an incentive that really focuses on increasing ridership or increasing the utilization of either transportation or other micro mobility options, whether that's an e-bike, is really a critical piece to it. I think with recommendation 4, we also have to be considering the disincentives to driving or the disincentives to single occupancy vehicles. And not saying that it all has to be accomplished within this single recommendation, but or not saying that I have like these perfect suggestion there either, but how we make it a less appealing option for people to decide to use the single occupancy vehicle. Oop, and didn't you were right on target, Mark. But I think that's a critical point, and James kind of spoke to that a little bit in terms of overuse of vehicles, however we want to define that. But so appreciate everyone's comments on that point and really wanted to stress the need to provide that incentive or support for more people to use public transit or non-single vehicle occupants, single occupancy vehicle options for transit.
All right. So maybe we'll go to Jamal, and then I might ask the co-chairs for your recommendation on what you're hearing in terms of handling this one. Jamal? We can all pause for a second while our phones blow up, and Jamal, feel free to jump back on when you're able to silence the phone.
All right, I think it's done now. I just wanted to add another maybe component of the idea to have a separate incentive for public transit and or e-bike or the like. For on the e-bike side, perhaps the incentive is for the purchase, but also for the charging as well. And so that could help to incentivize ongoing use instead of just the purchase and non-use. So yeah, I wanted to add that idea into.
All right, thank you. So Brian, hold for a second, just for the sake of time. Kim, Mike, it definitely sounds like we're departing from recommendation 4. I didn't quite hear anyone say that they desperately want to stand up an ad hoc group in the next couple of weeks to flesh this out. But what do you recommend at this point?
I think, and I'm just trying to react to what we've got. A lot of people had very good ideas, but the good ideas are very different than what was on the table. So I think I would suggest that we defer this and we make a commitment to consider it in one of the first meetings for next year, but that we defer it to next year.
Yeah, I feel like we've got two different things. One is this recommendation doesn't sound as if it's moving forward or it's ready to move forward. And these other ideas I think are awesome.
I agree.
But we're not at a point of fleshing them out, right? We're at a point of voting on current recommendations. So as hard as it is, I think I agree with Mike on this one.
Yeah, and I do want to come back to e-bikes first next year because I think that's a great idea. But there's many great ideas we're having to defer, unfortunately.
All righty. Jamal, we're trying to get a final comment in on this.
Yeah, I think there could be a path forward, which would be something like the state should consider a credit for public transportation options, including but not limited to like buses, trains, and e-bikes to low-income Marylanders, limited by income as determined by the legislature. So I mean that is it's taking the base of this, but also adding other options. And I totally respect, if we want to table this for next year, but I do think there's a path forward for considering this at this point.
Okay. Well, I heard the co-chairs in agreement on a path forward. So I guess unless I hear otherwise from them, we'll make this a top priority for the MWG's 2024 work plan. All right. Okay, Mike, should we move forward to the next recommendation?
I think so.
Okay. Next one is recommendation 19. This is one that was submitted by Tom Valentine. Line EV infrastructure incentives with owner-tenant responsibilities. So, Tom, if you're still on the line, do you want to speak to this one?
Sure, thank you. Just it seems to me that over time the incentives have been focused for good reason on the EV owners and to purchase vehicles and to subsidize their individual installation of equipment. And I don't sense that, I don't believe that the existing incentives are well aligned for where we're headed, where either individual development projects or individual existing apartment and condominium buildings will be installing equipment at higher scales. So it's just an aligned recommendation.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I support this one. Just so we're clear, the existing $700 incentive, I think, really focused on the sort of the low-hanging fruit, the people like me who have a garage or a driveway, or you can add a slow charger fairly inexpensively. But if you're a multifamily, maybe even assisted living or affordable housing owner with a parking garage or a large parking lot, installing the infrastructure becomes very expensive. And for greenhouse gas reduction, those are the people we need to reach. I think just the clean cars is going to eventually get everybody who's got a driveway and a garage. We need to make sure that we're providing incentive for the difficult to adopt. And that includes row houses, right? But at least at the minimum, we need to reach these multifamily housing, which not all of them are rich condos. A lot of them are apartment houses where investing is a problem.
Thanks, Garrett.
Yeah, I would say exactly the same thing. I think this is one, I find the language of this one a little bit vague. It was not entirely clear exactly what this might result in, but this, I think the example that Mike just gave is why we should be for this. It's very important that we see multifamily building owners start to convert spaces for folks to have EVs, and that can't be a thing that the one tenant who's thinking about buying an EV would have to incur the cost of and work through. And it makes a lot of sense that it should be possible for there to be some kinds of incentives out there that will support that multifamily building owner to put in infrastructure to support EV adoption by their tenants ahead of all the tenants demanding it and trying to find a way to pay for it themselves. So I think that's really important. I think it's probably fine that the language isn't entirely specific because it will be very situational how those incentives could be designed. It would be great if we had more specific examples to go to, but I'm quite supportive of this as a general principle.
Okay. Is there any opposition to this, or are we ready for a vote on it? Ava.
I agree with Garrett. The only thing I would just recommend is if we just put multi-dwelling units in there, just to make sure we're capturing those other units that may not fall under condos or some of the language that's captured currently, if that makes sense.
I think that makes sense.
And I guess, Tom or Ava, do you have a recommendation on where multifamily would best fit in here?
The state should align EV infrastructure incentives with multi-dwelling units, and then maybe to support building owners, condo associations, and commercial tenant responsibility. Or yeah,
I think that works.
okay. Thank you.
All righty. Mark, go ahead. Mark, you might still be on mute. All right. Maybe that was an accidental hand raise. All right. Any further discussion on this, or are we ready to call the vote? Oh, sorry, Mark. If you want to put a comment in the chat, then we can try to slow walk the vote a little bit. Any further discussion on this one?
Type fast, Mark.
Yeah, Ian.
One thing I'll just note that it's not directly related, but I was just stalling here. Is for multifamily, especially if we're going to have EV chargers, somehow we've got to figure out how to incentivize people to move their vehicles when they're done charging. If you charge overnight, if you're done in 4 hours or whatever, you go to work and the car's just sitting there, it means you're going to need a lot more chargers. So it's sort of related. I'm not sure it's an amendment here, but it's just something we might want to think about for the future.
I actually inserted some language in the bill that passed last year. If you look at it closely, it says that the sites must be labeled with the exact language which the General Assembly wrote into the statute about labeling, and that language says you have to move the car if you're not charging. So it's not apparent, but I actually stuck something in there for that purpose, since I was frustrated so many times seeing people sitting in Tesla charging lots not charging.
Perfect.
All right, and Mark from OPC, his mic wasn't working, but he put in the chat, I was going to ask about the word responsibility. In what sense do responsibilities exist? Legal responsibilities, question mark. Is the desired meaning ensure incentives support the installation of charging infrastructure in challenging sectors?
I think Tom must be looking for his mute button, but I assume we're anticipating that MEA is going to come out with a recommendation that multifamily has to begin including charging infrastructure, and so there will be a responsibility for owners and in some cases tenant if the condos, right, to put in EV infrastructure.
So I was looking for Mark's comment, but Michael's right on with what I was going to say.
Okay.
So I think I'd call the question.
All righty. Then MWG members, if you would use the hand raise feature to vote in favor. If you're voting in favor of recommendation 19 with the slight amendment where we added multi-dwelling units to support in the middle of the recommendation. And I see, I think that we might have everyone. Well, we'll do the opposition vote just in case. So thank you. Let's lower those. And then, all right, with the hands, Ben, is this Ben, are you in opposition or is that a late vote for?
I hit the wrong button. Sorry.
No worries.
Adult brain. I was voting for.
Great. Okay. Then I think that might be everyone, but any votes in opposition to this one? All right. And any votes, any abstentions? All righty. Cruising along here. Time check. We've got just under 30 minutes remaining in today's meeting. So we just did recommendation 19. The next one is recommendation 18. Right above here, dedicate increased tax revenues to support BEPS compliance. I believe this one's also from Tom. Tom, do you want to speak to this one?
Sure. This is along the lines of a sort of a incremental tax, trying to find a way to capture increases in commercial and other kinds of real estate taxes and divert some of those for decarbonization funding. I come to this from the point of view that there really will not be enough either private or public capital to fund the speed and the scale of what's required. And I think this is something that at least should be studied, and be happy to amend it to that effect.
Great, thank you. Jennifer?
I love the idea of more revenue, but I think it needs to be connected to polluters so that we have either a carbon tax or a cap and trade. I hate the idea of taxing some new solar developer or wind company. I don't think that seems off-brand to us.
Can I clarify? My thought is that as tax receipts raised or increased over time from the commercial property tax base, that a portion of that increased revenue to the county is diverted and earmarked for decarbonization.
Would
Think of
that
a
be
tax increment financing bond.
right? Is that adjusted for inflation, or
Not necessarily. It's just a concept to prioritize spending additional new revenues as the commercial tax base increases. Prioritize spending that on decarbonization of the building sector.
And Tom, did I hear you say you'd amend this to say that to study the issue, or?
Yes, I'm as you can tell, I'm in favor of keeping them somewhat general. The General Assembly is going to do what they do. These are suggestions on what to focus on, right? So yes, I think that's a good amendment.
Let's see, Jamal.
Yeah, I had a question about the word fund. What type of fund are we, are we talking about grants? Are we talking about loans, other financing? I think there are questions about that.
I would expect that this is sort of a revenue source for existing grants and funding programs. Not that it would create a new structure.
Gary?
Oh, Tom, I was just curious, would it make sense to merge this recommendation into recommendation 17 and make this a more comprehensive study, or do you feel it's important that we have one that's about decarbonization generally and one that's specifically about BEPS compliance? I feel like they're closely related. If we're getting into study territory with both of these things, they're definitely closely related.
17,
where we say consider.
Yeah, it wasn't specific to BEPS,
Right.
and I think that was unintentional because of the amount of property that's still outside of BEPS. I don't mind combining things, but I think the tax increment idea was more of an approach to BEPS, and the general tax deduction included BEPS, but also gave a vehicle for non-covered commercial and non-covered residential to make changes.
Going to Bob.
Yeah, I'm trying to make sure I understand. So when you talk about increased commercial real property and recordation tax revenue, you're talking about the marginal increase, right?
Yes.
If it were 100, so let me give you the example. If it were 100 today and it went up to 110, you're going to tax for that year the 10 that increased, right?
Well, I'm not saying it's an additional tax. It's dedicating a portion of that increase. It's like a tax increment finance bond. Yes.
Right. But then for the second year, it's going from 110 to, let's say, 115. So then in that second year, it's only 5. Is that correct? That doesn't carry over and keep rolling over. It's every year there's an incremental increase, and you're going to tax X percent of that incremental increase. Is that correct?
I think the amount that's diverted is something to be decided later, but it's a mechanism to capture increased tax revenues and divert them to a funding mechanism. And it's
okay. Let me phrase it a different way then. So for that first year, whatever that increase is that increase carried into the next year and the next year and the next year, or do you look at each year and look at the increase?
Well, I'm not sure. Look, I'm not fully understanding your question. It's not building by building. I'm talking about across a tax base.
Right.
And incremental change could be a 3-year look back. It could be 2 years. It's just a mechanism to prioritize the spending towards decarbonization. The percentages per year are not
all right.
decided at this table. I don't think anyway. It's just conceptual.
So a study would figure this out, I guess, is maybe a better way of saying it. Okay. The study is going to determine how to do it.
Yeah, Jennifer.
I'm wondering if we could change it to study ways to get revenue, which would include, and then you list these two things, because I do think that we need to have many more options studied beyond this.
I think the proposal I made is specific to prioritizing how we spend the incremental increase in the tax base, and that's the proposal I think I'd like to keep on the table. We haven't discussed any revenue raising measures as part of the work group in a very long time, and I'm just trying to focus on a mechanism that's currently in place that could be reprioritized.
And I don't know if we're going to have time in today's meeting to make it to. I think we have one revenue generating recommendation on the list, recommendation 21, but not sure if we'll get there today. Any further discussion on recommendation 18? All right, then co-chairs, do you want to call the question?
Yeah, go ahead and call it.
All right. Members voting in favor, put your hand up if you're voting in favor of recommendation as 18 as amended, study using increased tax revenues to support BEPS compliance. And including, okay, all righty, thank you. You can put your hands down and I'll go ahead and assist. All right, here we go. And then any votes in opposition? All right.
Did you get the proxies on that too, Mark? Are you going to add those back in later?
I believe I did. I think there was one non-FWG member that voted in that last one. And then was there a, I'm sorry, any abstaining from this? Great. Thank you. That one passes. Next is, where were we? We were on 18. Next is recommendation 20. Provide funding for EV readiness projects. Tom, do you want to address this?
So one of the things that concerns commercial real estate and in particular multifamily is the cost of off-site improvements to support EV charging, and they'll be variable depending on the location and the grid readiness. But when the reporting and the tracking of this in California shows that when it does kick in, it can be significant. The other thing is that reserving capacity that isn't used right away can be expensive, and it's just a general direction and recommendation that there be some provisions and some accommodation for the utility side infrastructure, and some ability to reserve that capacity if necessary without immediately incurring expenses at the building level.
All right, thank you. Discussion on this?
I guess in concept, I get it. But this recommendation is everywhere to everyone across the state, right?
Could be narrowed, tailored. You're right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think if we're going to focus it, maybe that would be an important aspect to add.
Mike?
Yeah, I would add, just for anyone who hadn't heard it, that the utilities are talking about massive infrastructure improvements that be needed. I mean, I've heard BG&E say they're talking about something on the order of 200 substations where, they normally take 5-10 years to get a substation approved and built. And we're talking about these all across the state in the context of a PJM that is already very much worried about, can they keep the lights on between 2025 and 2028 in Baltimore. So I do think this is a subject that needs to be taken very seriously.
Ed?
Yep, just want to second what and confirm what Mike is saying there. We know that there's going to be a tremendous build out needed for the electric system, for the clean energy transition, regardless of pathway. A lot of that is coming from the increased load from the EV side. So we do need support for funding those substations in that infrastructure. And I would also add that we really would need support for siting and permitting to make sure that we have the ability to build that infrastructure, even setting aside the cost. So wanted to add those comments.
Thanks. Brian?
Presumably the funding for these projects comes out of rates, right? It's a, the costs and a fair rate of return are included when the investments are approved by the Public Service Commission. So I can understand if there's maybe a mismatch in terms of the timing of when costs are incurred and payment is received, or something to that effect. But presumably this is something that's going to be dealt with like in a different venue. So if we're talking about funding readiness for private property owners or public property owners separate from the utility, that's one thing. But for the utilities, I think that this is something that has a framework for dealing with already.
All right, thank you. Ian?
I agree with Brian. Obviously the PSC is doing a study on overall grid capacity and reliability, not only focused on EV. We should have that by the end of the year, but and there's some preliminary results, but I won't go into it now. And yeah, I think that there is a mechanism for rate recovery, and PSC does its analysis when it reviews those proposals. It can handle the mismatch sometimes in timing. They do that all the time. So I guess my concern is it might be premature or in the wrong venue. So I think I agree with Brian on that.
Tom?
This is, and we've included some language in a previous to add multi-unit and commercial buildings. This is intended to be an offset to the cost of bringing infrastructure and upgrading neighborhood infrastructure to make the larger installations possible. I don't think there's a PSC or a cost recovery mechanism for the connection tariff. If we have to bring a high amount of power to a site or bring it a long way, the cost is on the person making the request.
Kim?
Yeah, I keep coming back to the concept I get, but the wording is just not there for me at all. I would have to vote against this one without getting more specific. So I just mentioned that if somebody wants to work on language and bring it back, I'm open to that. But at this point, I would vote against it.
With the language we put into number 19, that kind of focused it on multi-tenant or multi-unit condominium and commercial buildings.
Maybe.
Or could you do it? I'm sorry. I'm just responding to what Kim had said and what you had said, Tom. If it were funding for utility side, for infrastructure, utility side infrastructure that has to be paid for by the ratepayer, because it's really what you're talking about is the cost that you put on the building owner to run the line to the building, because that's what's not built into the existing PSC tariffs.
And that was the intent. I think the good thing about this is that I got it in on time and met the deadline, but it's not as clear as it should be. I agree.
So you're not talking about the cost of putting in the substation. You're talking about if you got to run a line from the substation to the building,
right?
Does the building owner have to pay for that infrastructure? So the current line running to the building is not big enough.
One solution I'm hearing is the possibility over the next couple of weeks of just adding clarifying additions to this.
I'm willing to do that if you want to move on. We have time to do that, right?
Yeah, I think October 19th is our next meeting. It's a couple weeks out. We're looking at that as really the last chance that the MWG has to approve recommendations to forward to the full commission for consideration.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so long as we don't have too many recommendations teed up for that last meeting, and when we conclude, I have a quick update just in terms of other agenda for that meeting. So co-chairs, do you want to table this and bring it back next meeting with additional clarifications?
I think that makes sense, provided we have time on the 19th.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Although I think I'd like to give Brian and Garrett a chance. They've had their hands up, so.
Okay. Brian, go ahead, please.
Sorry, actually, I should have lowered it. I think you guys all addressed my concerns. It was definitely Tom, with your clarification there. I see what you're getting at. I think it makes a lot of sense. So provided the language is clear enough, I think it makes I think it's a worthwhile recommendation.
And the thing that I was going to add, there within the Public Service Commission world, there is a working group focused on the reforms to the interconnection process and requirements. And I participated in that a little bit related to solar, where very similar issues happen with solar, where somebody who wants to build a big solar field and connect it to the grid needs to pay the cost of running the wire out to the grid. The same thing ends up being true for individual homeowners. So in some cases, people who want to put solar on their roof, if their neighbors have already done that and used up the line, the energy, the electricity capacity of the line serving their street, they're being told they have to shoulder all of the cost as the causer of the line having to be upgraded if they too want to add solar. And so the Public Service Commission has been looking at reforms to what is a fair and appropriate way to share the costs of having to upgrade lines. It sounds like, Tom, what you're suggesting here is kind of, we're asking similar questions. Is there, so to me, maybe it's appropriate to say the state should be paying, but maybe the recommendation would be more appropriate saying we want the Public Service Commission to also look at what would be an appropriate and equitable strategy for covering the costs where new loads are coming in. That may be covered by what the interconnection work group has been working on. I'm not sure. So that's the thing that I would say, like, that's the place maybe to start with if we're going to do further thinking about this between now and the next call, because this may or may not already be addressed there. And it'd be useful to understand, is it really necessary to call for public money, or is it just necessary to call for a PSC process change here?
Okay, good point.
Great, thanks. And thanks for offering to provide some clarification on that last one, Tom. And I think my hunch is this one might be all we have time for in the 7 minutes so that we have left for today's meeting. Going to recommendation 15, allow offsets in BEPS. Tom, do you want to speak to this one?
So, from my point of view, and I've always been clear about this on the mitigation working group, that the faster we want to get this done and the more cost effective, we need to find ways that credits and offsets can play a role. The Climate Solutions Now Act contains a power purchase agreement requirement for state buildings. There are utility scale RGGI credits involved, and been part of the success running up to this. And they're also being heavily relied upon in the preliminary scenarios for the 100% study. The BEPS as proposed doesn't exclude on-site power, like renewable power, when calculating the total energy use of the building. So it becomes part of the regulated load. And at the very least, I think that in the BEPS framework, there should be a credit or offset for renewable power that's either purchased off-site or generated on-site.
All right, thank you. Mike?
Yeah, some of my clients have already run into this. I mean, you're looking at the BEPS requirements and you're saying, well, what's the advantage of putting solar on my roof? Your BEPS requirements are going to be the same either way. What's the advantage of trying to buy more expensive solar energy over the grid rather than buying simply something produced by a coal plant in Pennsylvania? And I do think what we're interested in is how much greenhouse gases come from the building. So having some kind of offset, if you can demonstrate that you're actually producing less greenhouse gases because of your power source, is a certainly sensible approach.
Thank you. Gary?
Thanks. We've been, we're working on county version of BEPS here as well. And I think we've landed on feeling like it's appropriate for on-site solar to be credited in that way, but are opposed to any other kinds of offsets. I think it's both not in the spirit of what the BEPS policy is trying to do to make sure that we're actually making progress with the building stock, and on off-site offsets don't accomplish that. But also it'd be very difficult to administer. It's a whole different kind of process to try to keep track of offset purchases that folks might be making in an ongoing way. It's very different from questions about what are you actually doing to the building. So if it's framed as a more general approach to offsets, we will be against that. Thanks.
Thanks. Ian?
BEPS is a new policy, obviously, at the state level. Hasn't been implemented yet, right? The regs are, likely to be pushed out sometime in the coming months. I think it's a little early to start proposing, changes to the fundamental design of BEPS. The way it's currently written, it doesn't incentivize renewable power. There are some BEPS regs I know in other states that do allow that offset. It's designed to reduce emissions in an efficient way, which is, you know, obviously been a contentious issue in some places. I know Michael and Tom have their opinions about that. You know, I think that the incentives are designed to have an efficient electrification, which should reduce load on the grid, particularly at peak times. And I grant that on-site solar can help with that, distributed solar. I just think we have other incentive structures to try to accomplish that. You know, I recognize we're not meeting our solar RPS, but I just don't believe that this is the time to start making changes to BEPS, and that we have to address that in other ways. So I would oppose this recommendation.
Kim?
Yeah, I'm kind of where Ian is, that I don't think the timing is right for this one, partly because of where BEPS is. The other part is I think this again needs some tailoring. You know, we often offset programs, I shouldn't say often, sometimes offset programs can work counter to what the goal is, right? And so I think we've got to keep it focused. I think also, you know, treating it at, you know, 10% of baseline emissions would be a good recommendation there as well. So this is not ready for prime time in my mind. I too would vote against it.
All right, so we're about a minute away from 3. So one flag, if we want to extend discussion on this, there should be a motion to do so. Actually, given the time, let me just throw this to the co-chairs. How would you like to proceed?
If no one else wants to comment, I'd call the question. If there are other comments, my recommendation would be we defer it to the next meeting. But Kim, what do you think?
Anybody else want to comment on this? Yeah, I call a vote.
Okay, so then we're set up for a vote on recommendation 15, allow offsets and BEPS. The state should create a mechanism for BEPS covered buildings to use offsets or credits for a portion of required emission reductions. Members use the hand raise feature to vote support for this recommendation. See 4 in favor. Okay, I'm going to lower those. Any votes in opposition to this recommendation? Let's see. That's 11 members. And any abstentions? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't load the hands first. All right. Any abstentions? All right. Okay. So that's all we have time for today. We actually made it pretty far through. We had just recommendations 16, 14, and 21 left for discussion. So those will be reintroduced for discussion at the MWG meeting on October 19th, along with any others that we tabled to come back on that day. We also had Climate Commission members David Lapp and David Smedik present recommendations to the Climate Commission in its last meeting, and the MWG co-chairs decided that those recommendations would be heard by the MWG. So we've invited David Lapp and David Smedik to the next meeting to present their recommendations for potential endorsement by the MWG. So more to that, more on that to come. Co-chairs, any final remarks?
Thank you, everybody, for sticking through this.
Yeah, just big thanks. Great work.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.